Over the past weekend, we saw the Rage Invitational Japan take place, and this was the first kind of official tournament as part of Ignition series for Valorant, which is also a good indication as well as to how Valorant will be performing within the Asian region, right? And progressing within the Asian region. There has been a lot of community tournaments and the like, but when it comes to sort of official tournaments and tournaments that have sort of taken not the world necessarily by storm, but has sort of pricked up some ears a little bit, I think this is probably the first one, at least from the Asian region, that we've really had a significant look at. So being a CS caster and being quite an avid fan of the Asian CS region, I've been quite intrigued to see how Valorant will do here in Asia, and obviously particularly in Japan and Korea, because I think that's where the mass exodus of talent has come from Counter-Strike and moved to Valorant. You know, when we talk about players like Zeta, and then when we talk about teams like Absolute and MVP PK, the Japanese and Korean teams that sort of led from the front for both of their respective regions in Counter-Strike, have essentially moved over to Valorant and more or less killed the region within their CS community. It's a kind of unfortunate, right? We don't see any more Japanese teams, or we don't really see any more Korean teams competing at the top level of Asian Counter-Strike, but they are having a degree of success over in Valorant, and that's quite good to see. So I think when we go back and look at the Japanese region in particular, as far as CS is concerned, Absolute and probably the whole scene never really performed to the level that they might have liked to have. They never really got the ball rolling. And if they would have had maybe a little bit more support, then, you know, who knows what could have come from it. And I mean, they were never going to be like the best in the world or anything like that. But I think it was always quite tough for the Japanese region in particular to get that amount of support, because there really was only one good team. And even then, they weren't performing to the level that, you know, gets people particularly excited about the results that they're having. But I think you can sort of take a peek over to titles like Rainbow Six, and that's sort of where you get a bit of a better indication maybe as to where the talent level is for Japanese players as far as FPS titles are concerned, right? If you look at a team like Norengo and the results that they have within the worldwide sort of a region of Rainbow Six, when they go over to these sort of events like Six Invitationals and that kind of thing, they can even compete up within the top four. You know, multiple times we've seen a team like Norengo competing and taking a semi-final placing. They've haven't really been able to make it to the grand finals or anything like that, as far as I'm aware, although I'm not a Rainbow Six expert. But, you know, you could arguably put them in the top four worldwide at particular times in the history. There's probably going to be some Rainbow Six fans that are going to sort of balk at that or say maybe I'm wrong, but either way, they're competing to a good level, which I think is the main takeaway, as opposed to necessarily the specifics of their results. So with that in mind, I think you look at Counter-Strike in particular as quite a disappointment for the Japanese region as far as the results are concerned, and I think it makes complete sense for a team like Absolute to move from Counter-Strike to Valorant. And they've already kind of had a degree of success, right, in this Rage Invitational. So I think for them, you know, that's a fantastic result. And we'll see how they go in future. Hopefully, they're going to get the support that they need. But I think as far as Rage Invitational is concerned, right, it was quite a success. You know, you look at some of the comparisons, obviously, to CS, and you think, where the fuck was all these people that were watching the Valorant tournament, the Rage Invitational tournament, when CS was kind of popping off? And it seems like none of those people that were watching Valorant were particularly interested in CS, because to hit around 30,000 viewers for the grand final of the Rage Invitational is quite a number that is sort of unheard of, right, when we're talking about Asian CS. And I'm not just even talking about Japanese CS, I'm talking about the whole Asian region doesn't really get that many viewers for Counter-Strike, even considering there is betting involved and that sort of thing. So just having a Japanese stream and getting 30,000 viewers, yes, admittedly, a lot of them probably were English speakers who were quite interested, because this was one of the first Ignition Series tournaments, and, you know, one of the first big tournaments in the Asian region. But to have a predominantly Japanese-speaking audience, which hit 30,000 viewers, is actually quite unheard of. So the fact that, you know, you've got that Japanese-speaking market, and then you've also potentially got a chance for more penetration into the English-speaking market if more of these broadcasts come about in English as opposed to just in Japanese. I think you can only really see things going up from here for for the Japanese region and for the Asian region. So it's especially good signs for Japan as a whole after seeing the numbers that they were able to put on the board for the Rage Invitational. And it's especially good signs as well for the Absolute team, which is obviously now known as Absolute Jupiter. And they kind of went through the bracket undefeated, right? They barely even dropped a round. I think they went 13-1, 13-0, and 13-1 in the group stages or up into the semi-final. And it was kind of only when they got into the grand final against Lag Gaming where they did drop, a significant amount of rounds, but even then they didn't drop a map. They went 13-8 and 13-6. So for those guys, it seems like, coming across from CS has been quite impactful for them. It's really worked for them pretty well. And it's not a huge surprise, obviously, considering that there's so many parallels between CS and Valorant. But it is kind of nice to see this team, which has sort of been grinding away on Counter-Strike for so many years, having a great deal of success here early on in Valorant. I think for Japan, right, there's a great deal of interest, obviously, especially among teams and orgs as well. So that's another good sign. You've got big names like Absolute. We had Norengo, Cyclops Athlete Gaming, Scars Detonation, and Sun Sister, to sort of name a few relatively large Japanese organizations that have already taken an interest in Valorant and already have teams within this Rage Invitational Japan. And if that kind of support continues, it can only sort of look positive for the Japanese region as a whole. And again, to draw that comparison to Counter-Strike, there was quite a struggle to get that sort of support for teams in Counter-Strike. When you look at Scars and Absolute, those were two, one or two teams, depending on how you kind of look at it, that really didn't quite manage to get the support that they needed, but there certainly isn't really a lack of that in Valorant. I think for the Japanese region, though, the real test is going to come when we start to see more Asia-wide, sort of region-wide tournaments that sort of include the teams from Southeast Asia, the likes of Indonesia and Malaysia and all these sort of areas. And obviously China and Korea as well, because this is where, you see these sort of domestic tournaments and it's kind of hard to tell where teams are sitting in comparison to some of the international teams as well. So particularly interested to see how teams like the MVP PK team that moved over to Valorant would perform against a team like Absolute, because they were far and away much stronger in Counter-Strike. And will that sort of translate across into Valorant, or has potentially the Japanese region kind of found a niche maybe with Valorant? Overall, I have to say, though, it seems like it's quite a good start for the Asia scene in Valorant, and you can sort of start to see the strategic elements that come across from CS, the executes and the mid-round calls and all that sort of stuff, starting to materialize in Valorant as well in this sort of competitive environment. But I do still sort of think that we are really only scratching the surface of what can be done in a competitive environment in a game like this. And that's always going to be the case when you see a new game come out and you look back at maybe, for example, the history that is still quite fresh in Overwatch. If you go back and look at some of the early tournaments in Overwatch versus what teams are doing now in Overwatch League and even in Overwatch Contenders, some of the worst teams nowadays would probably beat some of the best teams back in early days of Overwatch, just because the fundamentals aren't quite there early on in the game. And I think we're still sort of at that point right now in Valorant. There's going to be a lot that's going to be discovered, and people are really going to be able to figure out perfecting the game down to quite an art over the next year or two, if teams continue to support the title. I think for me, one of the important things as well, looking at the comparisons between Counter-Strike and Valorant, is that the big moments are still there as well in Valorant. You see sort of the 3Ks, the 4Ks, the aces and that kind of thing in Counter-Strike, and the big clutches and that sort of thing, which are obviously I think the main draw of Counter-Strike as a title, at least for a casual viewer base. And that's still pretty obviously there for a game like Valorant. And even looking at some of the abilities, right, you don't necessarily get the feeling that they sort of overwhelm the game or take the game away, which is quite a positive in my book, coming from Counter-Strike, obviously. So it really seems like Valorant is kind of in a position to succeed where Counter-Strike failed within Asia. And I think when we look at early viewership in general and the sort of the hype that's around Valorant within the Asia region, you can see those early positive sort of signs for the places that weren't properly penetrated by Counter-Strike, particularly like Japan, particularly like Korea. So it can only sort of go up from here as far as I'm concerned for Valorant. And if regions like Japan and Korea really sort of come online, and, obviously we kind of expect and almost know that China's going to pick the game up and kind of run with it, then there's already kind of three like major sort of sub-regions within Asia that produce talent. Like when we look at Counter-Strike specifically, you would talk about the Chinese teams, you would talk about the Korean teams when they existed, and then you probably would throw Singapore in there as well earlier on, but now it sort of seems like it's Mongolia. So I don't know that it's necessarily been penetrating Mongolia quite as much as it has some of these other regions, but at least if you have those three sort of core regions of Korea, Japan, and China, and then you hope to see places maybe like Thailand and Singapore and Indonesia kind of getting online, that's, I think, where we're going to really start to produce good talent out of the Asian region. And Riot certainly has quite a good track record with keeping the Asian region quite interested in their titles, obviously, with League of Legends. Whether or not that can translate across to Valorant, we will be yet to see. And I think the same can really be said for OCE or ANZ as well. You know, we've seen a myriad of community tournaments that haven't necessarily amounted to kind of a huge amount in the grand scheme of things. Like, they haven't been particularly crazy. I think they're like $500 prize pool or something like that. So there's not a whole lot kind of going into them right now. But obviously the Oceanic and the ANZ region is actually quite strong domestically for Counter-Strike. So I don't know that we're going to see the same mass exodus from ANZ and from Oceania as we are likely to have seen, or have seen actually, from Korea and from Japan and some of the other Asian regions, just because our domestic scene is a lot stronger than it is in Asia. But if the money and the prestige is sort of there in whatever tournaments come for Valorant, I think there could be some individuals or potentially even teams that are maybe just below the top four that are enticed to swap over if they feel like they could be actually the number one team in Valorant. So I don't think we're going to see the likes of Renegades or Order or Avant or probably even Chiefs swapping over. But, you know, if teams like Ground Zero or Rooster or Truckers with Attitude or those sort of level of players, obviously not specifically saying those guys, were to swap over, they would actually theoretically be one of the best teams, potentially even the best team within the Valorant sort of area. I think you've still got quite a lot of talent moving over to Valorant already, so that, I suppose, is probably up for debate, but we'll see how things go with CS and whether or not teams stick around. I guess it's just a case of whether or not these players do enjoy Valorant, and I've seen some saying that they do and some that they don't. So it's kind of a case of wait and see. And not only for the ANZ region, but I think for Valorant as a whole, it sort of seems like a case of wait and see. Because a lot of the success that is going to come for Valorant, or should come for Valorant, is, I think, going to come down to how Riot really handles the game and whether or not they're able to keep a tight hold of it, similar to League of Legends, or if they want to allow a little bit more of an open ecosystem similar to Counter-Strike to remain in place. And I think that yet is unproven. So either way, it's going to be an interesting sort of 12 months within the Valorant community, and same for Counter-Strike, because I think the two titles are sort of aligned, at least as far as players are concerned or player base is concerned. So where one benefits, the other might fail in a way. But one can really only hope that Asian Counter-Strike and Asian Valorant are sort of not going to follow the same trend. So we can only hope that Riot doesn't forget about the Asian region and learns from Counter-Strike's mistakes.